Okay, so what we just saw was that in the case of pikuach nefesh, even if the person themselves is kind of, it's not the average pikuach nefesh person's kind of putting themselves in pikuach nefesh situation, you would be able to be over malachas deraisa on Shabbos. You're able to, go against biblical Shabbos prohibitions. Now, our question though is, are you allowed to put yourself into that sort of situation? So we know if you're in a socially sensitive moment in time, you're allowed to be mechal Shabbos. You're not really being mechal Shabbos. You're keeping Shabbos vis-a-vis, saving life at that point. But the question is, are you allowed to proactively put yourself in that situation? And we're going to find a correlate. We're going to find a correlate from the Gemara that'll kind of flavor the way we understand this question. So I guess to analogize back to our case, is the resident allowed to put themselves in an Eva situation so that they can then use the mechanism of Eva to have that informed, so to speak, their keeping of Shabbos in a hospital setting?
Like, would those nurses have been able to sign up for that as opposed to being forced?
Yeah. Right, but we do have kind of an analogous case, and this is straight from the Gemara in Masechta Shabbos, kind of in the beginning of the Masechta. So the question is, are you allowed to go out to sea? Now, the assumption is if you're going to go out to sea or on a really long trip, eventually, right, some of these trips would go on for 3 or 4 months at a time. What are you going to do about Shabbos during those months? Are you allowed to be a seafarer? Are you allowed to go out to sea? In mafligin b'sfina pachtim shlosh yom kadem Shabbos. You're not allowed to go to sea within 3 days of Shabbos. Okay, so this is already cryptic. Why would before 3 days be allowed and after 3 days not be allowed? How does this make sense? So the Rif and the Rambam they say that no, the question here is, you're going to be a passive passenger on this boat. The boat is more than 10 tefachim above sea level, so there's no issue with traveling really. You're not going to be doing any melachos. You're just pretty much keeping Shabbos on a boat. What's the issue? The issue that the Bryce is contending with is, wait a second, you're going to be seasick if you're going out to sea. Are you allowed to be seasick, choose to be seasick on Shabbos? If it's before 3 days, your body will get back to homeostasis and be comfortable and you won't be seasick. But if you go Erev Shabbos, you're going to be seasick. You're going to be violating Einik Shabbos. There's a religious principle to try to enjoy Shabbos as much as you can, to celebrate Shabbos really. For a Dvar Mitzvah, you'd be allowed to forego on Einik Shabbos. If it's not a Dvar Mitzvah, you're not allowed to forego on Einik Shabbos. That's how the Rif, who lived in the 11th century, and the Rambam, who lived also, kind of around that time period, that's how they read this Gemara. The Rivash is a much later halachic decider. The way he reads this Gemara is that he says, fine, when you're in a sakhan savash situation, all things go. If you're planning to be in a sakhan situation, you're not allowed to do that as long as it's only 3 days before Shabbos. If it's more than 3 days before Shabbos, you're allowed to kind of go about your life. You don't need to be cognizant, so to speak, of Shabbos. If it's less than that, you wouldn't be allowed to. Important caveat: if it's for a mitzvah, even 1 day before Shabbos, you'd be allowed to. If it's not for a mitzvah, you'd need a full 3 days. Now remember, we still need to figure out how we read what a mitzvah is. Okay, so that's a massive divergence. According to the Rif and the Rambam, the question in play is Einik Shabbos. You would definitely be keeping Shabbos. This Rivash, the question is, are you allowed to put yourself in a sakhan savash? So then you would be able to mechal Shabbos or not.
So let me see if I'm following with you so far. So just mostly that last part, the Rivash, we're talking about specifically very similar to the case, I guess, with the nurses like signing up. Are you allowed to put yourself in a position in which you're allowed to rely on the fact you're able to like supersede Shabbos? So we know that if you're in a place of sakana, something bad was going to happen, it's a life-threatening situation, of course, you're allowed to override Shabbos for that. But the question is, are you allowed to put yourself in the position that you would be allowed to rely on that, heter, that you're able to supersede Shabbos? And he's saying that pretty much by going on the boat within 3 days, you'd be putting yourself in that situation where something bad's going to happen and you're going to pretty much have to violate Shabbos to protect yourself, which you're allowed to do. The question is, are you allowed to put yourself in the position where you're going to have to rely on that?
So according to Ravash, as long as it's 3 days before, you'd be allowed to. Because more than 3 days before, you can kind of act with your kind of own moral volition. You don't need to take Shabbos into account. But if it's within 3 days, you wouldn't need to take Shabbos into account. Now, what's the logic here? So a much later source, that's Tzemach Tzedek in I think Siman Tzadik Beis, which is Siman 92 in Ar Chaim, what he writes is that this principle at play here is a derabanan. So in other words, on the deraisa level, if you were to ask Moshe Rabbeinu today, are you allowed to put yourself in the concept of Vash? She says, listen, the Torah doesn't say you're not allowed to. The Torah says if there's a concept of Vash, you're allowed to be Mechal Shabbos. So on a pure legalistic level, from a biblical standpoint, you're allowed to kind of go live your life. And if you're in a Sagas of Vash situation, you're allowed to be Mechal Shabbos. The Rabbanan, again, unspecified when these Rabbanan lived, at what point, they said, no, you do need to take Shabbos to your equation, according to the Rivash, only if it's within 3 days. If it's not within 3 days, you can still, kind of the Gzera de Rabbanan only apply to the first 3 days. That's how the Rivash and the Balamar are reading it.
Okay, interesting. So it's really, and even when they say you can't, it's not that you're not putting yourself into a situation. Meaning, it seems like you're always putting yourself into the situation. The question is if you have to even think about doing that. And they're saying there's a cutoff of when you do have to consider it versus like when you don't have to consider it.
Yeah, but unless there's mitzvah.
Unless there's a mitzvah, right?
And the assumption is, if there's a mitzvah, the Chachamim said, you know what, you do you.
So then you really just don't have to worry about it at all, even if you're kind of like putting yourself in that position.
Yeah, and I know based on our previous sources, this is wild. So if you would ask the Rivash, kind of back to our conversation, are you allowed to sign up for a non-shomer Shabbos residency? He'd say 100%. Just like you're allowed to show up on a boat, you're allowed to kind of show up to the non-shomer Shabbos residency. Now, if you were to ask that same question to the Rambam and the Rif, they'd say, no, you don't have any legal precedence for that. Now, how does the Shulchan Aruch take this, right? So Shulchan Aruch is written by Yosef Kari. He lives kind of in the 14th century. He's from the Jewish Sfarad. He got, his family got kicked out of Spain. They went to Portugal. From Portugal, they kind of went to Tzfat. And he was really a big part of the incredible resurgence of Jewish literature and Jewish life in Tzfat at that time. In his Shulchan Aruch, he writes as follows, assimilating these sugyas to try to figure out, do we follow the Rif and the Rambam or do we follow the Rivash? So he writes, you're allowed to go to sea, even for a mitzvah. Fine. We place a game of shish place. Try to get them to stop. Okay. Now, he pretty much says the Gemara verbatim. Now, remember, the ambiguity, the problem that we kind of had with our Gemara was it was ambiguous. It wasn't really saying what principle was at play. Okay, so let's leave the Mechaber for a second. We don't really know how he paskins, but let's go right down to the Mechaber, to the Ramam. So the Ramam, writes kind of the last two lines. Then you'd be allowed to. And he actually quotes the Rivash. So he says, you know what, the principle at play here, would you be allowed to Mechal Shabbos, even when the Yid himself is not just a passive actor on this boat, but is actively doing something for the passage, for the seafaring, then you'd be allowed to. He's quoting the Rivash. So the Ramah is choosing to read the Balamar and the Rivash into our previous Gemara, using that as legalistic precedence. Okay, so it looks pretty good so far, back to our residency conversation. Now, do they use the Rivash or not? It becomes much clearer in both the Mechaber and the Ramah. So in this the first highlighted stanza is from the Mechaber. It says, "V'yem rishni uvesheni uveshlishi mutter latzes latzes." You're allowed to kind of go to sea. So Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, you're allowed to go to sea. V'imach kachir lelachal Shabbos. And if after that you come into a situation where you have to mechal Shabbos, mipnei pikuach nefesh mutter, right? Because it's loy sakana, it's a sakana for you. V'tzarich ve'in kan chilul, right? Okay, so we know unambiguous in the Mechaber's paskening that we're following the Rivash on this one, that you're allowed to make a choice to put yourself in that situation as long as it's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. If it's Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you're not allowed to. Now remember the caveat, if there's a mitzvah, because he's quoting our same Gemara. So Haggah, yesh aimim. How do we define what a mitzvah is? Yesh aimim shekol makim, now this is the Ramah, yesh aimim shekol makim she'adam heilich l'schayra, eliris pnei chavere, chashav hakol dvar mitzvah. If you're going for business, or you really need to see your friend, that's considered a mitzvah in this context. And only going for kind of a trip, you want to go tour, you're kind of between your first and second year of medical school, you want to go to Guatemala, that's the only case that would be that's the only case that it would be kind of rishus. Again, very broad understanding of both the Rivash and a very broad understanding of what a mitzvah is. And this he actually takes from other sources, the Rebbeinu Tam. It sounds like, especially with the Life and the Times, this was a topic that came up multiple times.
So before we go on, this is, pretty groundbreaking. This is like, he's really saying you can really put yourself in the position where you're saving lives, even though, you're going to have to rely on violating Shabbos, which would be mutter, but you're allowed to even put yourself in that position as long as you're doing a mitzvah. And because we're defining mitzvah as something just so broad, it really kind of sounds like going into residency with the intention of having to break Shabbos because of saving a life is really fine to put yourself in that position. I think it sounds like the really only problem, the obvious problem that would come up from this is like, a lot of what you do in residency is not saving lives. But it sounds like if hypothetically you were saving lives with every action you did, you'd really be completely fine. Because even to accept the residency, knowing full well you have to rely on that heter.
Yeah, and remember the technical saving a life is not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about fostering ill will. And the assumption is that if someone sees from religious doctor not giving the same standard of care that they would give to anyone else, to a non-Jew, and that non-Jew is going to say, you know what, he's not treating me well. He's not treating me like he should professionally because he's a Jew. And now I'm going to hate him. I'm going to hate all Jews. That's technically putting us in an Ava state. The idea of sakanas nefashos is also going to be kind of broader.
Right, like we mentioned before, expanding that legality of breaking Shabbos because of hate of ill will still apply. So you're allowed to put yourself in that position for saving lives, and then we extend that also because of ill will to non-Jews as well. And so
there's
you really
a lot of nuance here. There's
like
a lot
broad
of
range. Yeah.
Okay, so if you were to kind of just stop in the 15th, 16th century, this would be really easy take.
Yeah.
And I hope, Mark, you've maybe rethought your priors a little bit on how we're thinking about this nuanced topic. That being said, Baruch Shekivanta l'das gedolim, I could defend your position as well. So the Mari ben Lev and Magen Avram. So the Magen Avram, his name is, by the way, I found this out just now, Avram Gambiner. I only knew him by kind of his book name.
That vaguely sounds familiar, yeah.
I think I read it in who would ever call him that? So he lived he kind of lived in Galicia in the generation kind of after the Mechaber and the Ramah, and he wrote a super commentary on their works. Possibly, especially in Orach Chaim, especially in the first folio of Shulchan Aruch, probably one of the more important works. He vigorously dissents with the Rivash. He vigorously dissents with the Baal Mar and says, "Wait a second, we just learned the Rif and the Rambam, and we learned not just the Rif and the Rambam, the Rush, a bunch of other opinions that say no, we're not reading the Gemara that way. And now you're finding a minority opinion in the Rivash and in the Baal Mar." And by the way, if you're going to actually look back at the Baal Mar says, by the way, this is a possible read of the Gemara. So now you're taking a possible read by one individual, by a minority opinion, and now you're basically saying, have at it.
That's what we go with, right?
So he, just on intellectual grounds, he both argues with Mechaber and he argues with the Ramah, and he says, you can't play ball like this. Shulchan Aruch Harav, who's kind of chronologically after him, Shulchan Aruch Harav was very popular in Hasidic circles. He was one of the Talmidei Amagid, so anyone coming from a Hasidic background like myself would end up using this psak. He kind of is an in-between. He says like this. Since you know that unequivocally you're going to have to be put into a situation that you're going to mechal Shabbos, you're not allowed to do it. I feel being Mauritian, even if it's Sunday, right? Because wait a second, we're trying to reread our Gemara like the Rivash and the Baal Mar. Everyone else is reading the Gemara the other way. And I feel like Var Mitzvah. Fine. So on the other hand, we should take this original opinion of the Rif and the Rambam. But remember, the Ramah, the Mechaber, the Rivash, the Baal Mar, they all say that there's a second accurate read of the Gemara, and therefore, if someone's going to choose to paskin like them, don't tell them to stop. He says the other thing. Let's fine. You can follow the Ramah, but let's just walk about his pronouncement about what a mitzvah is. Because this idea of this broad analysis of what a mitzvah is, going to see a friend, for that you can tell him not to do it, or also for parnasa. Because there's so many people like the Magen Avram and like all our primary sources in the Rishonim that say you're not allowed to. Okay, all right. So this is kind of a more nuanced approach. He's saying, wait a second. On one hand, we do need to recognize that Ramah and Mechaber are heavy hitters in halacha context. On the other hand, their pronouncement of what a mitzvah is, being that they end up being a minority opinion, we need to kind of take it with a grain of salt. And this is kind of his in between. So he says, on an individual level, try not to use this heter. If someone is using this heter, you don't have grounds to call them out on it. On the other hand, you do have grounds to call them out if they're trying to use a very broad definition of what a mitzvah is. Now, how do we work this back into, according to the Shulchan Aruch Harav, how do we work this back into our conversation about residency? So he says, listen, you really shouldn't be using this heter. You shouldn't be using this heter in the Chaber Ramah. If you are, though, I can't stop you, provided that you're doing it for a good reason. Now, the question is, would he view residency as a good enough reason? I would say possibly yes, and we're going to read later sources. Shem Zalman Auerbach happens to usually echo the Shulchan Aruch Harav in his psak, and we'll see how he kind of addresses it. Now to go to the Mishnah Berurah again chronologically is later.
Before you just do that, I think it's important to also realize in the context of what we said earlier that becoming a physician alone was not a moral responsibility. So that alone may cause it's hard to say that, if you're going to rely on the heter, which by the way, you may not really supposed to do, in the context of it's a mitzvah to become a resident. Well, we sort of said that that's not itself so simple, just because it's not exactly a moral responsibility to become a physician. It was more of a moral responsibility once you're a physician. So just adding that, not saying yes or no, I'm just saying
there is the word
mitzvah. I think the word mitzvah gets sort of lost sometimes. And so if we're saying don't use it so broadly, I think the immediate, at least my knee-jerk reaction would be well, why wouldn't becoming a doctor to save lives be a mitzvah? But we did sort of establish that it may not be so clear to say that it's a mitzvah.
Yes, reading based on Moshe Feinstein's Shuvah, which by the way is echoed also by another Shuvah of the Chasam Sefer. I would say though that being that the Ramah chooses to use Rabbeinu Tam's version of what a mitzvah is, which is very broad, right? And all the Alter Rebbe here is all the Shulchan Aruch Harav is trying to do is backtrack a little bit on the wording of the Ramah, right? So he says for commercial activity or to see a friend, all you really need to prove a mitzvah, so to speak, would be to be slightly better than that ostensibly, right? Okay. So mitzvah in our context may be more broad. It might not be as broad as the Ramah tries to make it out to be, but it may be a little bit more broad, right? And so being a doctor may be a more broader idea.
Maybe somewhere in between. It's hard
also to remember that you are a medical doctor once you graduate medical school. And in those situations, you are actually helping to save lives. You are not totally electing to do it. You are more or less capable, depending on which medical school you go to. But,
I think, yeah, exactly.
All right. Mishnah Berurah. So the Mishnah Berurah echoes kind of what we've been seeing before in the Magen Avraham, and he goes as follows. That's fine. Continuing on to Chav Zayin. Upashit. He is very unequivocal here. Everyone says it's not allowed. He's going even stricter than the Shulchan Aruch Harav here. You wouldn't even be allowed to be ever Isser D'Rabbanan. Now, I don't think the Shulchan Aruch Harav was that strict. D'Rabbanan maybe be a D'Rabbanan on a D'Rabbanan, but the Mishnah Berurah is going is speaking that strictly. And even if you won't be able to go on this commercial trip, because no one's going to want to take you, even if it's for a mitzvah. Because wait a second, I don't care if it's Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday. I'm reading the Gemara like the Rif and the Rambam, and you don't have the moral authority to decide not to keep Shabbos later on. All right, Aruch HaShulchan, again, slightly later than the Mishnah Berurah, but more or less a contemporary. Aruch HaShulchan was, first of all, it's just an incredible work. It's written by again Michael Epstein. It was written in Soviet Russia, it was written in Russia at the time. There was a lot of censorious kind of notes. Reading the Hakdama to it is actually quite entertaining for that reason. But he also, what he does is slightly different than the Mishnah Berurah and slightly different than the Alter Rebbe. He kind of rereads the Mechaber and the Ramah to make it sound more like the Magen Avraham. And so he kind of takes away your ability to say, you know what, I'm just going to rely on the Mechaber and the Ramah. It's a hard read, and it's a hard reread of the Mechaber and the Ramah. But what we do know is he's saying no game.
So it sounds like we kind of found what we thought, at least what I thought at first, is sort of like this golden ticket. And then it seems to be a lot of backtracking, putting in perspective that was a very specific person saying that with a very specific interpretation of the Gemara. And so it's not simple to just rely on that golden ticket.
Not simple at all, right? It almost sounded for a second there that we did have a blanket heter. Now, we're going to figure out how our now more modern sources deal with this conversation. Okay, so now we're going to try to figure out how do we assimilate some of these primary sources into our, kind of modern applications.
Yeah, so just before we go into the more modern application, again, it seems like we built up a series of allowances, like saving life is an allowance, because of ill will that extends to non-Jews, and so we got a more broad definition of saving lives, and that what super trumps Shabbos. And then it seems like we had this massive just explanation of what this Gemara is talking about, and we have like the diverting sources. And it seems like we're just trying to figure out in which application we can use the one source that seemed to be very lenient and put everything into like this golden ticket framework. But then we had a back check of that, so we're trying to figure out where's the in between that we can use that main like Shulchan Aruch that said that you could really do it.
Yeah, and so to kind of echo the way that Tzitz Eliezer would say it, I know that from the Mishnah Berurah's perspective and the Aruch Shulchan's perspective, there is no kind of easy going way. According to the Shulchan Aruch Rab, there is a heter. If you were to ask them Chaber and the Ramah on a good day, they would say that you're allowed to. If you were to ask the Rivash on a good day, they'd say you're allowed to. So if there are other extenuating circumstances, if there are only derabbanans at play, or potentially if it's a Jewish hospital and there's real pekuach nefesh at play, you may be able to actually sign up to the residency. Now, you brought great points, right? What about all the other ancillary tasks that you need to do, like charting or walking through elevators and kind of the cornucopia of things that you're going to end up doing in a hospital are not related to life-saving care, and that really will need to kind of be addressed piece by piece. But for now, what we're gonna, our question again is: Shabbos residency an imperative, or is it kind of more elective? And that's what we're going to try to ask the question. We're going to ask this question, so to speak, to three different poskim. Moshe Feinstein, who's kind of a sign of the Psak in the United States, Shem Zalman Auerbach, and Rebbe Schachter. Now, just as a preface, what kind of you need to look at over here is Shabbos, is Chilul Shabbos, is the idea of keeping Pekuach Nefesh on Shabbos. Is it pushed off? That's to say that Pekuach Nefesh comes and supersedes Shabbos, or, and that would be Techuya, right? It's kind of pushed off. So it's still Chilul Shabbos, not just on the semantic level, but a legal level, but you need to do something else more important than Shabbos. Or is it Hutra? Does that mean, are you allowed to do it and Shabbos doesn't exist anymore, right? So the question is, does a Pekuach Nefesh just push away Shabbos, or does it create this new way of keeping Shabbos, where Chilul Shabbos doesn't exist anymore? Okay, so it's largely an academic question. So Dechuya, though, would say that it's a necessary evil. It's much, and therefore being in a Pekuach Nefesh situation is a much more limited scope. Hutra, Shabbos becomes mundane. Shabbos just as a regular day when it comes to Pekuach Nefesh.
Yeah. I would just add, just because I know when I first read it, I guess it seemed a little bit confusing because it's kind of similar, but just to summarize, and maybe you can clarify. So the difference really being is that when we say all these things that we said really supersede Shabbos, and therefore you're allowed to do it, even though like it would seem that it goes against Shabbos, is it because you're allowed to do it in this situation, or is it because it's almost as if at this moment it's not even Shabbos? So like, do I have to feel bad that I did it because really it was like kind of a wrong thing, but I was allowed to do it? Or like, was it just total free reign? It wasn't even Shabbos at that moment, and therefore like no guilt, like I was totally in the clear. That's sort of how.
I don't know if I'd peg it about guilt, but I guess the question would be, how much do you need to Pekuach Nefesh?
Right, exactly. Like if it was really wrong, like, but I'm allowed to do it, therefore how can I tamper that? Whereas if it's not, if it's really just totally fine, then I don't really have to be worrying about like how I can do it in the least damaging way.
Yeah, so to make it a little bit more practical, if there's 10 people and they're all, kind of given the same Pekuach Nefesh situation, if it's Dechuya, all 10 people are supposed to try to make some excuse, pretend that they're tying the shoe at that moment, and then the unlucky guy has to do the Isser, so to speak, has to go Michal Shabbos. If it's Hutra, all 10 people can show up at the same time and there's no issue. Now, on a practical level, everyone paskins like Hutra, but they say Dechuya. So that's because the point is that even if there's such a minute risk that it's almost infinitesimal, you would still be Michal Shabbos. Therefore, on a practical level, we say Hutra, but on a technical level, we say Dechuya.
Meaning academically versus in practice, it's got to be, different.
Yeah,
and academically you shouldn't, but practically, because there's always practical implications, you go for it.
Yeah, well, I remember one time I asked both two different about him. One Rav happened to be a paramedic, and the other Rav happened not to be a paramedic. I said, someone fell and they broke their wrist. Are you allowed to drive them to the hospital? The paramedic Rav said, absolutely. They might have a concussion. There could be a brain aneurysm. We don't know. And then the other Rav, who was a simple guy, was like, I don't know, broken wrist. I don't think you die from a broken wrist. Now, chance there, would you die from a broken wrist? Absolutely not. But the paramedic said, there's an infinitesimal risk, and therefore you'd be allowed to. I guess kind of that's another way to go about it. Now, by the way, even if we say Hutra, you still, according to the Ramah, have a really important principle. So Isa, that if there's any way to minimize the Isser through doing a shinoi, right, doing something in a strange way, or through kind of using a different method that will get you to the same place, it might take a few more steps. As long as that's not life-threatening, the Rama says you would have to do it. Now, this is going to have major implications. When we talk about note-taking, we talk about kind of everything else. How prepared do you need to be coming into your Shabbos shift? Do you already need to open up some vials? Do you already need to, kind of make sure that Erev Shabbos you come in to make sure everyone's IV is in place? That's going to be a conversation for a different time, though. Okay, so back to our original question. Is Shomer Shabbos Residency imperative, or is it kind of more elective? Rav Moshe takes a Dechuy approach, and he says that an observant doctor has to avoid being on call Shabbos, for Shabbos by any means necessary. He has to try to switch shifts. He has to try to pay off his residency colleagues. In another place, he says, by the way, fine, let's say you had to be there, right? In Ava, you couldn't get around it. Still, you need to get an apartment as close to the hospital so that you're not going to end up driving there. Because fine, when you're in the hospital, if you're doing Pikuach Nefesh, I can't stop you. You shouldn't be stopped. It's, Dechuya. Still, no one let you, get there for Shabbos in a non-normal way. He said you'd have to walk. He'd say, you'd have to get an apartment close by the hospital. These could all be major inconveniences for a Jewish life. What if the hospital just isn't in a Jewish neighborhood? Now, you're making a big decision for your family, for yourself. I will say that if you actually get down to the weeds of Rav Moshe, or if you'd ask a Pesach who ends up taking Rav Moshe's view, there are other dispensations, but these are generally his views. Now, so how would he answer if you came to him straight and said, am I allowed to sign up to non-shomer Shabbos Residency? Luckily, we know, because Fred Rosner and Misha Temler asked Rav Moshe, and this was the answer. So the subject is training in hospitals. They have this in a great book, in Practical Medical Halacha by Fred Rosner. This is from 1990. The question is a physician obligated to seek training, employment, or attending physician status at a hospital where there's minimal or no conflict between a hospital policy and Shabbos observance? The answer, kind of, it depends. So he says, a physician, so Rav Moshe says, listen, you have a responsibility to get the best training possible. If you're, if you can go to the best training in the world, or you could go to kind of, a lesser status, a community hospital, you technically need to go to the best place in the world, because eventually that's how you're going to be saving lives in the best possible way, provided that you have the certain fortitude to maintain all the halachic requirements despite the less favorable environment.
Right.
So, and in this, in no way, if the superior training to be acquired at the price of Shabbos desecration, even for rabbinic ordinances only, the student physician must forego this educational advantage at the prestigious hospital. This sounds a lot more like we're coming, full circle. Because what was Avram ben Avram, the Nishmas Avram's approach? He said, listen, technically, on a technical level, you could sign up for it. And technically, if you really knew Hilchos Shabbos backwards and forwards, you could keep Shabbos in a hospital. But practically, you need to be a Pesach of Rav Moshe status, and you'd also have to, be impervious to peer pressure. So he says technically it's possible, but you need to do your best to switch all shifts. You need to really know Shulchan Aruch backwards and forwards so that you can keep Shabbos on shift. You need to live as close to the hospital as possible. And for all these reasons, by the way, it is actually important for us to start this conversation now, because, March of, our graduation year, when we find out where we're going for match, that's probably not the best time to figure out how to learn the whole Hilchos Shabbos. So it is important to start this conversation wherever a person's at. And hopefully,
so before we move on to the next, opinion, how would this sort of, to me, what this sounds like is almost like, technically, if you were going to keep Shabbos in every possible way, then you could do it. Would you be able to explain this in terms of whether or not we're agreeing or disagreeing with the Ramah, or going more with the Rambam, like how those heterim may be impacted by what we're saying here?
So it's hard because, like any good Rav, he's not necessarily telling you. But if I were to guess how Rav Moshe is kind of analyzing the kind of information, it'd be that, listen, to keep Shabbos in the way we're talking about, push comes to shove, Ikra Din is a D'Rabbanan, right? If you're in a Pikuach Nefesh situation, you're technically allowed to do anything. The question is, are you allowed to put yourself in that situation? The answer is no. But if there's a very low likelihood of you being in that situation, at what point is it just not part of the equation anymore? So let's say you're coming in with a commitment to do everything you can to be off call. And then, by the way, even if you're on call, you may be able to get around with things.
Right.
In that case, he says, yeah, go have at it. You really need to be careful. But it's a sliding scale. The more certain your Chil Shabbos is, and the less likely you are to be able to use the setter. The less certain your Chil Shabbos is, if there's one Shabbos in 4 years and, push comes to shove, there's just no other way that week, Rav Moshe might be much more understanding of that.
it sounds like we're taking that situation with the boat and we're saying that like if there was if we're minimize the chances that that boat would cause issues on Shabbos, then you don't have to take into account. Same way if it was 3 days before, you don't have to take it into account. And so you're
Yeah.
locking
So
yourself in
the way
that
you'd read that,
situation. Yeah.
the way you read that is, there's a chance that the boat's going to get to the destination before Shabbos.
Right.
You know what? Maybe you guys will get lost. Maybe you'll have to Machal Shabbos, but you don't know. And the question is, how much of you don't know? How much of that is acceptable? How much acceptable risk is there? And that is a sliding scale. So it's really hard to pinpoint exactly where that scale would be.
Right.
And by the way, Shabbos and Yom Tov might have slightly different importance. One's Nisr Karis, the other's Nisr Malchus. There's definitely a lot of other factors to consider, which, by the way, really highlights that you need to talk to competent Rav, no matter which kind of direction you end up taking. Now we're going to go to Shabbos Zalman Auerbach. Shabbos Zalman Auerbach wrote this great set of Shabbos Shuvas, Minchas Shleima, the Nishmas of Ram, which is a great compendium on medical halacha that goes all Seder Shulchan Aruch, is also written kind of with direct influence by him. Shmir Shabbos Kol Hilchasa, written by Rav Newport, is also written by him, greatly influenced by Shabbos Zalman Auerbach. He was, incredibly influential from his, really young years. He wrote kind of the defining work on electricity on Shabbos. So he takes the Dechuya position, but he learns it in a radical way. So he says, wait a second, what was our issue until now? Our issue until now is that you're putting yourself into an Ava situation. On the other hand, what if there's real Pikuach Nefesh already present? In other words, what if there happens to be one Jew in the hospital, or one Jew on your shift, probably more likely, that happens to be in a Pikuach Nefesh situation? Then he says, the Torah just said, don't put yourself in a Pikuach Nefesh. The Pikuach Nefesh already exists. If the Pikuach Nefesh already exists, you don't need to be inconvenienced by doing Pikuach Nefesh or not. So he says, a person doesn't need to avoid and this is really important the way he writes his Shuvah, or in any way be inconvenienced by a case of Pikuach Nefesh for a Jewish patient that's critically ill. For this reason, if one has Jewish patients, he's allowed to be driven to the hospital on Shabbos, nor does he need to switch his shifts. Now, we'll maybe in the show notes, we'll figure out how to get clippings of Shmir Shabbos Kol Hilchasa, where kind of a lot of this stuff is just written, black and white on paper. So he takes the view of Dechuya practically, and he says that, listen, practically, if there's Jews in the hospital, you can accept the residency. If there's no Jews in the hospital, you wouldn't be able to accept the residency. So he has this weird take. He says, listen, I'm not even talking about Ava. I'm taking this out of the case of going on a boat on Shabbos, and you're just asking me to phrase this slightly differently. Are you allowed to sign up to Hatzalah? There's already going to be Pikuach Nefesh situations. Are you allowed to sign up so that you could try to give slightly better care? 100%. Okay, so based on using a different mechanism of psak, he's coming out with a radically different answer. Now, it is important to note, though, that there's a big kula and a big chumrah to both these opinions. Rav Moshe's opinion is not based on the contingency of whether or not there's Jewish patients or not. According to Rav Moshe, you could go anywhere. You could go to Idaho, go to the least ethnically diverse town in Idaho and still practice medicine, according to Rav Moshe. According to Shabbos Zalman Auerbach, said you would never be able to take that residency. You have to go to a place where there's a high likelihood of Jewish patients being present. On the other hand, Shabbos Zalman Auerbach, provided that you can get the right hospital, says that you can be much freer. You don't need to get an apartment close to shift. You don't in any way need to be inconvenienced. You can go straight from making Kiddush Friday night for your kids, straight into a taxi and head off to the hospital.
I think maybe you can clarify something. I may have missed this when we originally discussed it, but the case of, let's say, the boat, where you're putting yourself in that place where you're going to have to rely on the heter of the fact that there's going to be Pikuach Nefesh. I didn't understand that in the context of ill will. I thought that was, even if it were like, a totally Jewish, boat situation where there's just going to be Pikuach Nefesh and someone's going to, taking the Misham Eva, the ill will, out of the context, I thought that was still a question.
So right, just to clarify, the boat situation, the question is, are you allowed to create Pikuach Nefesh for yourself?
Right, which is why we're using that as our basis of putting yourself in residency, because it's similar. You're going to there is going to be Pikuach Nefesh, and you will have to rely on a heter. And so, can you put yourself in that situation where you have to rely on that heter? That was my understanding. Is that
so far, right? So, in the case of the boat, the Pikuach Nefesh that you're creating is being on the boat. In the case of signing up to residency, the Pikuach Nefesh that you're creating is Ava.
I mean, it's the extension. You have both, really. I guess you're making the distinction between if it was a non-Jewish hospital. I mean, I'm saying you're making the distinction if it's a hospital with no Jews, then it's specifically that only where you have to rely on that ill will.
I know it sounds subtle, but it's radical.
Okay.
So he's saying as long as there's any halachic pekuach nefesh, overriding Shabbos pekuach nefesh, you have just a right as anybody to be there. He actually says, I'd prefer you be there because you're going to do Shabbos in the hospital in the best way possible. A potential non-religious Jewish resident won't have the same intentionality. So he actually says you should prefer to be there. Now, how this works out practically is actually worth a normal conversation with both Avram and Avram and anyone else that kind of uses this. But on the face of it, he's subtly changing what the Pekuach Nefesh is. Pekuach Nefesh so far throughout kind of this presentation has been a Pekuach Nefesh for yourself and for other Jews that you are creating, because you're socially engineering a situation where you'd be able to violate Shabbos. Here, you're not socially engineering it; it already exists. And the question is, are you allowed to be on shift for it?
Okay, so I think I understand a little bit better. He's really completely changing the frame of the conversation. He's really shifting what the scenario is and saying that, but you being in a hospital, it's not you putting yourself in a position where you have to rely on Pekuach Nefesh Heterim, because those Heterim are going to exist anyway. There are Jews in the hospital, that Heter is there. There is Pekuach Nefesh going on. You are not really putting yourself in that position. It's not like you going on the boat by being in the hospital.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
Now, again, remember, big Heter here, but there's a massive chumrah. And the massive chumrah is,
right.
You show up and there's no one there. What do you do?
Right. So like Kings County Hospital, rabbis told me is very few Jewish patients. Probably there's good chances where there's no Jewish patients at all. This particular heter may be a more difficult thing to use.
You wouldn't be able to use Shlomo Zalman's approach. Methodist Hospital OBGYN, which is really close to kind of Crown Heights community, every Shabbos you're going to be able to play ball. Vascular surgery on Shabbos, where a lot of Jewish patients would probably not elect to have a procedure done, going to be harder. Yeah. So again, each one comes with its with its caveat. And now we're going to get to a statement by Rav Hershel Schachter just to complete our kind of our modern sources. So he says, amongst other reasons, he says, by the way, this idea of putting yourself in a Pekuach Nefesh situation as being a derabanan, he doesn't buy it. That's a big chiddush by Rav Hershel Schachter, by the way. Most opinions would say that it's derabanan, but kind of this is a statement. Even after completing his school years, the future doctor must take special care to make sure that his Sabbath observance is ensured by his Sabbath observance residency. If this cannot be arranged, the student must simply look for a different profession.
This is a tough one.
he holds no punches. He does not accept anything that we've said until now.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Just let's do the summary and then we'll then I'll add my
just the summary of the modern sources. We already did the summary kind of the primary sources. According to Ramesha, Shabbos is Dechuya. Since it's Dechuya, right? It's a necessary evil. You need to avoid this necessary evil at great personal cost. Yishem Zalman doesn't. He says that you don't need to avoid or be inconvenienced by an existing Pekuach Nefesh. And for this reason, if you're treating Jews, you're allowed to stay on shift. If only non-Jews are being treated, you have to switch. Rav Schachter, he prohibits this on many fronts and recommends that you get a new day job.
So I guess my question being, right, we knew that this conversation was really just a conversation. That's all it really is. Just to bring out the different points and to understand where certain heterim may come from and where certain people disagree. I know we try not to come with any definitive answer from these presentations, like it being that it's just a conversation, and sort of the definitive answer has to come from eventually who you're going to decide to ask and which rabbi you're going to decide to choose. But I guess I'm asking, you're presented with these three, extremely holy people, all saying like radically different things. Is there a general rule of who we tend to actually practice like? So both of them are just like,
you're asking if there's a consensus.
Sort of.
So here you get into this area where halacha is by nature parochial. It's much more local to which community you're part of and who you trust. And by the way, I really think that for that reason, having this conversation, and again, this is just a conversation, I did smicha, but I never did shemesh. I am free of this responsibility. I chose medicine because it's arguably less of a responsibility.
That's amazing that it's less ethically debatable. But yeah.
Yeah, everyone has their preference, and we all have our burdens to bear. But yeah, it really is going to depend on how you identify, how you choose to have this conversation, and with which Rav you have this conversation with. This is already beyond the scope of what is appropriate for any of us to really assume for anyone else. But you have the opinions here. you can hopefully have a better appreciation of where they're all coming from. And hopefully this kind of helps someone in their own quest to understand these topics for themselves as they become kind of an intelligent consumer of halachic rabbinic advice.
That perfectly said.
All right.
I mean, great presentation. Thank you so much for all the hard work you put in, as always. We hope to make a few more of these and really go through the topics. And yeah, thank you to everyone listening.
Yeah, if there's any suggestions or critiques, please let us know.
Yeah. All right. Well, till next time, we'll see you guys.